Warren Mundine, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having us. Yes.
Now, in the lead-up to the 2017 conference that produced the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the request for a voice to Parliament, you said the push for recognition needs to capture the hearts and minds of Indigenous Australians. Polls suggest that the voice to Parliament has done just that. Why would you stand in its way?
Look, when I look at the polling and I look at the reality of what's on the ground, like I've spent 3 days a week travelling across Australia through my business. You know, I've got about 1,000 Aboriginals who work for me, and I've got a whole businesses in Western Australia, Northern Territory and Queensland and New South Wales and that. That's not what I hear on the ground.
But are you saying that the polls have got it wrong? Because it's a reputable polling company.
I'm not challenging the polling company. What I'm saying, I think they got it wrong in the sense that when I talk to people on the ground and I listen to people talking, because it's always important to listen and observe what's going on around you, I say the biggest majority of people are not yes and no people. They're actually people who, and there's some people on the ABC website have actually said this, they haven't even heard of the voice yet. And there are other people who have heard of the voice but they don't know what it is yet. And I'm not claiming that means that the no campaigns are in a good position. What I'm claiming is that there's not enough information out there.
Well, let's have a look at some of the things that you've said about it and understand where you're coming from. You say that the voice is a threat to Aboriginal communities and organisations. In what way is it a threat?
Well, in regard to talking about in the First Nations people, so currently today I'm a chairman of a mining company, so I can't do anything on my mine site, even if building a toilet, without consulting, discussing, negotiating and coming to an agreement with the traditional owners of that country. Now, I'm a great believer, I've always written about this for the last 30 years, I'm a great believer in those First Nations, and they are the ones who can speak for country. So, for instance, I'm a Bundjalung man, I can, with my other Bundjalung people, can talk about country. No one else can. And so that's where I'm coming from in that area. So
well, might I just bring you back to the question, yes, which is what you said was that the voice is a threat to Aboriginal communities and organisations. I want to understand how it could act as a threat to organisations and communities.
Well, yeah, so I live in two worlds. One is the legal world and one is the real world. And so what I'm talking about there is that once we do those negotiations about extension of a mine or a mining project, we come to an agreement and it goes to the minister in Canberra to be signed off of the minister of that state. What we have now is that we have third parties who are trying to interfere with that process. Well, all they have to do, instead of going to the traditional owner communities, they can actually go to the voice, and then they can actually talk to the voice about recommending to the minister that they do not sign off on these things. And that's a problem. I believe that the First Nations, the traditional owners, are a voice, and we need to empower those voices rather than building another layer on top.
So just to understand you though, because you also described the yes case for the voice as a, quote, vision of bureaucratic control, centralised government dependence. How is that a fair description of a body whose role will be to, and I quote, it may make representations to the government? How can that be described as a vision of bureaucratic control?
Well, when you look at the word may, and there's a lot of arguments about what that actually means by the legal professions, I'm not going to get into those arguments because I'm not a lawyer and I'm definitely not a constitutional lawyer. What I'm talking about there, when you say may, it doesn't say you don't. So you can make a decision, you know, I want to put my arguments to the government about this, and I want to put my arguments about that. So it's not saying that they're not going to do it. It says they have that power to actually make...
Yes, but would you agree that in a common sense understanding as well as a legal understanding of the word may, that the body in question, that is executive government and the Parliament, is not obliged to accept those representations? Isn't that the reason for the inclusion of the word may make representations?
As I said, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. All I know is from real life experience. And when someone has the word may there, it means that they can. That's a very simple, common sense approach to that. And the other thing too is, and the Prime Minister has said this on many occasions, he said it will take a very brave Prime Minister to say no to the recommendations of the voice. And they're his words and not mine.
I think that was in relation to a specific question around alcohol control, a question that was posed to him at Garma.
But it covers a whole lot of range of other issues. If it can be about alcohol control, it can be about funding, it can be about a whole wide range of other things.
As we said, the Prime Minister was talking this evening. One of the things he said in his speech was that an entire people have been kept so long at the margins. Now, we know consistently from Closing the Gap reports that they've only been, the targets of closing the gap haven't been reached, and there's only been incremental improvements. Do you accept the PM's argument that the status quo is not acceptable for First Nations and Indigenous people?
Look, first of all, I challenge, he says, that, and if you can correct me on this, that you said an entire group of people. Well, it's not the entire Aboriginal people out there who have been marginalised and not getting ahead. I'm an example of that. Megan Davis is an example of that. A whole wide range of people of that.
But do you accept that Closing the Gap, as its work is to show us what Indigenous people and First Nations people across the board are achieving, and unfortunately, those reports just show year after year after year that the targets are not being met, and that gaps in education, in health, and certainly in terms of Indigenous incarceration, a national disgrace, are not being met. So there is a great deal of unmet need. Yeah,
look, there's a lot of stuff there, but it's not about in regard to that they have been totally marginalised about it. It is actually, it's about outcomes. When I was appointed to chair of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council by Abbott and then reappointed by Turnbull, we looked at a whole wide range of areas, and the problems that we had in education was the failings, and I think the state and territory governments get a lot away with a lot of this stuff because it's not a federal issue. They're state and territory issues, and we looked at those areas and we found that they had a failing of actually getting Aboriginal kids to school. So it was the state and territory governments who have had those failings, not the Commonwealth government. We went through a whole wide range of issues to get kids to school. And in fact, we worked with Aboriginal communities in getting elders and that who would identify kids not coming to school and then work with those parents.
Would you accept that the economic emancipation that you talk about, that you want for Indigenous and First Nations people, that you can't achieve that level of emancipation across the country while the levels of disadvantage are still so high?
Well, economic development resolves those issues, and I talk about a few programs. One was the Indigenous Procurement Program and the Indigenous Economic Strategy Program that was brought in 2015. We had an Indigenous economic program that was worth only $6.2 million, and this is not federal money. This is about contracts that were going to Aboriginal businesses that would have went to Aboriginal businesses.
Many people in the sector, people who've been working on the front lines, talk about the exhaustion of continually having to reapply for contracts, for funding. And the thing about the voice that they argue is that it will give them continuity because advice will be given at the
welcome to the
level.
business world. There's not a business in Australia that has a lifetime guarantee of a contract. You get contracts and you go. But I'll give you the figures. The figures have taken $6.2 million in 2015. I've got to say this is the most successful program in the history of Australia. It's now worth $8.7 billion. 45,000 jobs have been created in that process. 3,200 Indigenous businesses have been created in that process, and 37% of those businesses and employment has been in regional remote Australia. So that program has been massively successful. When people
yet, at the same time, I want to come back to where we started, which is that those polls are telling us that something like 80%, and the Prime Minister referenced these figures this evening, support the voice. I just wonder, are you missing something about the importance of this proposal?
I'm saying that I spend 3 days a week in Aboriginal communities and working with thousands of Aboriginals, not just 1 or 2 or 300 or 50 and stuff like that. And I can tell you from my experience of talking to people that the yes and no campaign haven't got the numbers from those people, and that people that they haven't heard of the program, and you've got it on your own website here on the ABC, and people who have heard of it still don't know what it is.
So clearly a long way to go, but in the meantime, thank you for coming on this evening. No doubt we'll see you again and often. Mundine, thank you.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Thank you.